Hi. So I can close out of this, I can minimize out of this. Um, Sorry, I noticed that. I wonder how they generate these suggestions of the art because I never watch, I don't even watch like half these things. Like, I've never watched indoor games and sports. What the fuck? What, what is that even? Oh, chess, yeah, okay. Well, literally never watched Terraria. Okay, sorry. ADHD, Kiori. Uh, okay, no, I don't want this open. I want, yeah, that's it. Okay, so I've said some things in the past that have a great start out to the video. I know. I said some things in the past that have irked some people, so I thought I'd make a video on 0.001% of those things, which are like very vaguely described here, with the hopes that, if I, well, not the hopes, I mean, if someone asks me one of these things in the future, these conversations come up, I can just kind of, instead of explain it again or whatever, I just have this video that I can link. So if you're only here for one of these things, at the end, or at least I'm gonna try to remember to put like if I get to thing number two and there's like, you know I'm at like X minutes, X seconds, I'm just gonna put that timestamp right after here. So at the end of the video, there should be a timestamp on all these things. So if you want a timestamp for one of these things, because I'm not gonna edit it into the video, just skip to the end of the video and they should be written like next to things. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm gonna have to think of like how I'm gonna explain these things. Okay, so oh my god, I've already had fucking. Alright. Already had 2 minutes and I've done nothing. Okay, so I'm just gonna explain these things and I'll pause like, well, whatever, it doesn't matter. So the first thing, which is the burden of proof thing, this is the hardest one to explain. So if the explanatory power here seems like bad, the just don't let that be a judgment for like the other two, because I'm much more confident in my ability to explain those things than I am in my ability to explain this one. So burden of proof. So this starts by I think you should try to attempt to like formally or more formally describe what your idea of the burden of proof is. And my claim is that when people say burden of proof, it's not an empty thing to say. Like, it does mean something, but most people like have, their reasoning skills or whatever. They've developed them in whatever way, and sometimes, not always, when they say burden of proof, they're referring to these, informal reasoning skills. And then other people who have generally developed more or less the same informal reasoning skills interpret that as being what it means. So there is communication of meaning there. So that's not that bad. I still think it's bad because it's important to have good terms that are more well defined, and just understanding this stuff is like an important part of, having some kind of idea of how things work. So just because a term, using a term can be useful at times, doesn't mean that the way that the term is technically defined is good, which is obviously a bad thing if it's not. And it also doesn't mean that we can't improve a term, use a different term, etc. So in this case, but that's not that bad, because at least some meaning is being communicated. The really bad use of the burden of proof is when people try to use it to use like the technical definition, and I do air quotes when I say definition, because it's not really a definition, to prove something. That's when everything starts to fall apart, like it's really, really bad. So there are a few ways you might think of of defining this. So one is fuck, I'm choking. I'm just gonna, I can't actually think, but I'm just gonna stop pausing the video so much because I think it's kind of stupid. So one is, in order to make a claim, some evidence has to be given, or it's useless. So there are some problems with this. First of all, simply the fact that a person thinks something can be evidence. For instance, like if you ask Michael Jordan about basketball, just the fact that he thinks something about basketball is in itself like evidence. Like that's like a form of evidence. So it's like authority argument. Calling that fallacy, well, it's not a fallacy because, I mean, the problem with these fallacies like ad hominem or whatever is that, okay, sure, authority argument or whatever, it's not a robust argument in the sense that it's not like a formal logical argument. So when I use an authority argument or whatever, or it doesn't mean that thing is true in the same way that I can prove that like 2 + 2 = 4. Like the constraint isn't as strong, but it's still useful. I mean, we don't need to have only 100%, only robust, only completely formal arguments in order to understand something or prove something or talk about something. Like sometimes that's not an option. So we do this instead. Shit, let me pause this. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, you need to. So the next interpretation is that or at least, well, this is a corollary of this interpretation, and people will say that like evidence. Okay, so they'll explain the definition of evidence. They'll say, okay, well, you can say something that's evidence, but evidence is more broad. Like that, someone saying something is included in evidence. Therefore, well, you have to say something in order to move, or there needs to be some kind of evidence to move the probability of something, or to make something more certain. Now, since evidence in this case is just literally defined as like something that makes something more probable, they're literally just saying you need to provide something that makes something more probable to make it more probable. So it's just a tautology. It's useless. Now, then people will often, they'll give this like the neutral position or something, and they'll say like to move something from the neutral position you need to give evidence or something, but this isn't even a meaningful idea. Like this is an empty idea because that you can't define neutral position like generally. It exists on some like case by case basis. Like for example, even our intuitive concept of what a neutral position isn't like if I asked you to describe some general situation, you wouldn't be able to. And a good example for this is if you see like this is a very specific example, but it's an example nonetheless. Let's say there's some cup that's upside down. It's like it's not see through. You can't see so yeah, you can't see through it. I made this cup, and it's written on it. I have written on it. Like I have a piece of paper taped to it, and it says, "Watch out! There's water under this cup. If you pick up this cup, all the water will come out or something, and you'd be like, okay, well, that's reasonable, I'm not gonna do that. But then how about same situation, but the piece of paper says, watch out, there are diamonds on it. Okay, so in that situation you're gonna be like, okay, well, they're just fucking with me, there's not diamonds under this cup. So you can't define like some neutral position. Like generally it's something that, you know, it's something that we understand like phenomenologically, and it exists like on a case by case basis. It depends on like a lot of different variables. Like in this case, it's like, okay, well, diamonds are very rare and expensive, so they're probably not in this cup. In other cases, it's like, okay, well, most upside down cups don't have water under them, but you know, why would this piece of paper be on here if there's not water under it? So this is something like this is too computationally difficult to just define simply and generally, right? It exists on a case by case basis. So, this idea of neutral position, I mean, what does that even mean? We use evidence. We don't have a completely neutral position. What would that even mean? Anything? Our opinions and our understandings of things don't exist in vacuums. They're affected by many details. So, when you say burden of proof, right? It doesn't actually entail anything, because it's like, it's completely directional. So let's say you have like person 1 and person 2, and they're making, person 1's making claim X, and let's do this, and person 2 is making claim complement X. So the claim that negates that, how do you decide which side that this burden of proof gets applied to? Now, a lot of people make a mistake, and this is what strong atheists do a lot. This is a big mistake they make. They say, well, the burden of proof is on the people who claim that God exists, because they're claiming something that God exists. But if you claim that God doesn't exist, that's, I mean, both of you are making positive claims or whatever the fuck. And the problem is that even if you don't make a positive claim, like even if person 2, right? So let's say we have the same situation down here, but we have person 2, and person 2 is not claiming the complement of X. They're just claiming like Y or something. Okay, first of all, that's still a kind of claim. Saying that we're not certain enough to say something is still a kind of claim. But how do we decide? Like, you say, okay, we need a burden of proof to go to this, but how do we sorry, I'm choking. So even if we're able to distinguish evidence that's part of the argument, and I'm doing air quotes, I just realized my camera is on. Okay, well, whatever. It's not supposed to be. So even if and I'm doing air quotes, distinguish like evidence that exists outside of the argument versus evidence that exists inside the argument. Like, I guess that most people would agree that for the diamonds versus water under the cup example, that's evidence that exists outside of the argument. Like, it's evidence that exists outside of whatever, you know, concept we have of the burden of proof. So if I ask for the burden of proof, like, they'd be like, okay, well, that exists outside of the argument. So how do we distinguish? So even if we can distinguish evidence that exists outside the argument versus evidence that exists inside the argument, how do we distinguish, like generally, how do we generally say that which of these situations has necessary outside evidence to justify claim 1 and which ones don't? Like, it's completely separate. You know, we can't just say, like, what if I was claiming there was something different under the cup? I mean, which ones is the claim 1 justified with the outside evidence, and which ones is not? And the more elegant way to interpret this is that, you know, we just have a bunch of ways that we decide stuff, and sometimes claims are justified, sometimes they're not. There isn't any difference between an actual argument, that kind of evidence or whatever, or there isn't any important difference, and certainly no formal difference between like an actual argument or whatever and stuff like, okay, well, diamonds are probably not under this cup, like reasoning that exists outside of the argument or whatever. Now, I know that was a very long-winded explanation for this, and the reason for that is, I mean, you can get a foothold on this concept and derive it by just understanding, like, by just trying to define the burden of proof in a more formal way, but people have a hard time, like, coming to that conclusion, so it's better to give some examples for why, like, it doesn't actually have any useful application. And I guess another good question to ask, and this is something that should give you a foothold on it. And this is good because it actually tests your definition. Like, you could formally define the burden of proof. You could just think of some formal thing, and that doesn't go anywhere. But if I ask you to actually give a situation where the burden of proof is helpful to understanding something, then you start to realize, okay, well, it's a bunch of bullshit, because that actually tests your definition. So, okay, I'm gonna pause. Okay, I think I'll just wing this part. I'm very good at explaining this because it's a much simpler concept. There's no such thing as individual/group identity, and so a lot of people say, so there's this like Jordan Peterson crowd, etc. That crowd of people. I do actually agree with those people on a lot of things. One problem that they have is that they're obsessed with this idea of individual/group identity, and the things that they refer to and their importance are indeed, like, I agree with them on those things. I think those are important things, but what I have a problem is with these terms, and I'm going to explain why these terms are bad. So they say a lot, like, whatever, outgroup, whatever, are they define people based on their individual identity or based on their group identity. And, like, for group identity, they'd say race, and for individual identity, they'd, like, if you ask for example, and individual, they'd say IQ. But so the very elegant way of just explaining why this is completely fucked is that every characteristic can describe an individual with that characteristic or a group with that characteristic. So when I judge people, like, if you judge someone based on their race, okay, well, race can describe a person with that race or the group of people with that race. And groups can be, very big, they can be very small, they could even be one person. Like, maybe there's a characteristic that only one person has, so you define them based on that. But there's nothing special about that. Like, you could have, like, there are characteristics that we judge people on that a few people have, like more than one person has, and no one disagrees that that's a good thing to do. I mean, like, if you ask these people what, like, if someone robbed a store, and we judge them based on that, there are many people that robbed stores, but they would still say that it's, individual identity. So what am I proposing? I'm proposing we just call some characteristics are more useful for determining things, and those are, like, the ones that they call individual characteristics, and some are less useful for determining things, and those are the ones they call the group characteristics. But any any characteristic can determine some stuff and can be applied to an individual with that characteristic or a group of people with that characteristic. So using the terms individual and group characteristics as defining traits doesn't mean anything. I mean, it just doesn't do anything. Okay, that was fast. Okay, 1920. Okay, minimum wage / net neutrality, etc. are fucked. They're bad, but they're not as screwed up as libertarians say they are. So first I'm going to explain. Well, this was what I used to say. I guess some libertarians say it too. And this is kind of at the core of most of their belief. I guess the elegant way of going about this is just looking at choices before or after someone offers you a job. So if you have, like, a bunch of choices, I'm opening MS Paint. Yeah, like XCC. Okay, so if you have like a bunch of choices, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. These are your choices, or some arbitrary number of whoops. Okay, so how do I select? Fuck, I'm low IQ. Wow. Select. There we go. Alright, so this one on the left is your choices before someone offers you a job, and then this one on the right is your choices after someone offers you a job. Now, as you can see, you have all the choices you had before plus the job. The fact that the job was offered in itself, now things relating to that might bear on the choices, but the offer, exclusively the offer of that job to you, that relationship, when libertarians talk about that obviously doesn't make the other choices worse or something, like it's an extra choice. You could of course make the argument that and I guess you could definitely argue that this is one reason that it's not as fucked as the libertarians talk about, is that you're protecting people, like maybe they have bad decision making, so you want to protect them from making some bad choices. Okay, fair enough. That's a consistent, somewhat sensible viewpoint you could debate like about all day. Now, so why is it not? And this is the same thing with net neutrality. Like, it's just another choice that people get offered. Like people talk a lot about how, okay, well, net neutrality, they can bottleneck you and offer you worse services. Well, no, net neutrality is trying to make it so that there's like this, equality of services that the ISPs are allowed to offer you, but that also means they can't offer you faster. I mean, there's going to be some discrepancy in the quality of services that they're allowed to offer you because they're able to price gouge, or I mean, that's a loaded word, but whatever you want to call it. But who's to say that they'll get worse and not better? I mean, I guess the equilibrium you'd expect is whatever quality they have under net neutrality. Like there'd be some plans better than that without net neutrality, and some plans worse than that. But there's just going to be some discrepancy. You can't just assume that it's going to get worse. It has nothing to do with that. There's not even a powerful restraint on which it's different from minimum wage, because minimum wage is at least a constraint on how little you can pay, whereas net neutrality, there's, as far as I know, not a constraint like that. But whether or not there is, this example of, okay, well, you're prohibiting people from offering people extra choices, it still applies. Okay, so why are libertarians wrong about this, though? Well, the reason that they're wrong about this is because... how to explain this? Okay, well, I'm going to call this marginal utility. So imagine you own a business, right? And you're charging like $4 for some product, like on some mass scale, or I mean, it doesn't. But let's just say like you're selling multiple of them. It doesn't need to be, but that's just gonna be my image of it, and they cost $4 each. Okay. And now let's say I start selling them for, and they only cost me $3 to produce, or whatever, or such that like I am netting utility when I sell them for $4. But now let's say I stop selling them for $4 and I start selling them for $6 instead, right? Well, the people that are buying those products, so let's say a lot of them, like some people stop buying them, but enough people buy them such that I'm still netting like more utility than I was before. And yes, utility is subjective, okay, but that doesn't matter. I mean, I'm, as a business owner, I'm making that decision, and the fact that I'm making that decision is what's important. So you would think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, right? Well, this is the same thing, right? Governments are saying, okay, well, we have these resources, we want to distribute them effectively, but we don't have the manpower or whatever, like necessarily to do this and this and this and this. So instead, we're using like this market as a middleman in order to distribute them effectively, and we're doing exactly what I did with that $4 product as a businessman, but with jobs. We're saying, okay, sure, these jobs that would be sub minimum wage paying, yeah, they help people, but by taking some of those away, it makes the other ones that remain better enough. Like it makes like the equivalent of the $6 product now. It makes them better such that it makes up for the jobs that it's taken away for the decision. So the discrepancy here is not anything like this, right? It's about who is, I guess essentially in charge of, or at least in charge of in this respect, of these resources. And libertarians say, well, okay, it's these employers, and the statists, well, they should say, what they should say is it's the governments, and the governments are letting you distribute the resources the same way a business owner would, but they have these restraints on them. So the discrepancy is entirely in who owns the thing, and not in, obviously, I mean, this concept is completely objective. I mean, even with perfect decision making, and like, so that you can't just trick people by offering some shitty choice and then they accept it. Even if people were like perfect actors or whatever, in this specific sense, there would still be a purpose for having like a minimum wage. It's not completely pointless. So let's see, 1928. All right, so now we're going to talk about consequentialism and utilitarianism, and the best way to get a foothold on that is, wait, I need to take a drink of water. Best way to get a foothold on that is by understanding that everyone can be a utilitarian without changing any of their core beliefs or whatever you want to call it, by just replacing what they want with utility. Since utility is not well defined, if I just say, I could just say, well, what you want is utility, or it's utility to you. Now you're a utilitarian. So consequence isn't well defined. Everything has a consequence, and everything can be thought of as being judged on by their consequence, unless you have some much stronger constraint on what a consequence is than it's usually thought of. Because, okay, if you're a deontological guy or whatever, and you believe in like rules as opposed to consequences, whatever the fuck that means, like if you can imagine that, then you're judging actions based on their consequences, like the consequence whether it breaks this rule. So everyone's like a consequentialist or a utilitarian in that matter. So it's not well defined. Now these terms, they do communicate some meaning, because people that identify as utilitarians tend to have very similar beliefs. But obviously you see the problem here with using these terms, like they mean something more than that. Like we should be much more specific. So that's the problem with that. Damn, that was quick. 26:35, so 27, 28. Okay, yeah. I'll just do 28:35. Wait, where's? Oh yeah, here it is. I thought I had it open already. 28:35. I know I keep adding stuff, but this is probably gonna be the last one. Okay, golden rule is empty. How am I gonna explain this? Okay, I just remembered I wrote this like a while ago. Jesus Christ. So I was barely 16. Huh. But it's actually decent, so I just figured I'd go to this instead. So I'll read it, because I guess why not. Okay, so golden rule never does any moralistic work in favor of any theory whatsoever. Some people actually think the golden rule can do conclusive work in favor of a moral theory. And now I'd extend that now to saying that it really does nothing except making people empathize. Like, so, by the way, so for those of you that don't know, the golden rule is the idea that do unto others as you would like done to yourself. And if you the step of that thinking process where you think about other people is important, but it doesn't do anything other than that. Okay, so, but I clearly can't watch. Let's say there's a murder. I'm watching and I'm the only one able to intervene. How do I apply the golden rule? If I apply it to the victim, I ought to intervene. If I apply it to the murderer, I oughtn't to intervene. Wow, I was a very good writer back then. What just happened? There's a conflict of interest. My moral maxim is telling me two distinct things. How do we disambiguate this conflict? That means, like, how do we solve the conflict? Obviously, context. Anyone with half a brain can see what's going on here. The golden rule requires a metric. See, subjective. Okay, whatever. It's rather measure whose interest is greater, the real stinger. If we had such a metric, the golden rule would be completely obsolete. So this response, which is the one you get, is it would just make the golden rule obsolete. Okay, so, and then you can see the rest here. I just, because people often say, okay, well, you applied it to an extreme. But, like, obviously, that I was just picking an extreme example to show the absurdity. I mean, you could just pick some less absurd idea, and the exact same thing would happen. So, yeah, that's why all those 5 ideas are bullshit. Yep. Okay, awesome. Bye-bye.